The ballroom glittered like a promise. Crystal chandeliers threw a dozen suns across a sea of black ties and silk gowns. Cameras hummed along the edges. On the stage, Isabella Lane's smile was practiced, perfect at the corners, unyielding at the line of her jaw. Beside her, a small girl in white, clutching a ribboned microphone, Sophie, was all knees and shy teeth, waiting for applause that tasted like safety. If you want to see how this twist unfolds, stay with us and subscribe. It matters. Michael Hale stood beyond the velvet rope where the floor gave way to service doors and low ceilings. He wiped his palms on an oil-streaked rag, the motion habitual, as if he were back in a boiler room instead of the wash of light and perfume. He wore a cheap vest that had been his uniform for 5 years, frayed at the collar, pockets full of odd screws and a roll of tape. In the pocket closest to his heart was a dog tag on a cord, dulled at the edges. It caught the chandelier light like a wink, and then hid again. Ella sat on the far side of her, legs swinging from a maintenance stair where dust settled like quiet. She watched Sophie on stage the way a little ambassador watches a foreign capital, wide-eyed, impressed. Ella believed her father could lift a truck if he chose. She believed he had once been something heroic, because he read books about soldiers, and because his hands, when they smoothed the hems of her shirts, moved like someone who knew how to fix what was broken and keep it whole. Tonight she had a gold bracelet around her wrist. Michael had found it in a corner of the building and bent the wire back into place so it would stay. From the ballroom, the applause rose and fell like a tide. Isabella took Sophie's small hand and gestured toward the microphone for the speech she had written and rewritten until the lines of it held no more tremor. The gala was a ledger of dignity. Donors, photographed smiles, a banner about corporate responsibility folded like an alibi above the stage. Isabella had spent a decade building that ledger. She knew how to count the ways a company could be seen as generous. She did not often count the soft things, sleeplessness, the small invisible debts people carried. She did not often notice where the ledger left people out. Michael noticed everything. He noticed the scuff on the back door, the way the bartender's sleeve was patched in 2 colors, the scent of spilled wine and lemon sanitizer. He noticed Sophie's freckled ear and the way her braid shook when she laughed. He noticed Isabella's shoes, sensible and unscuffed, the kind that said, "I have work to do." He noticed the young man at the front, Richard Torres, leaning against a column, smirking with the easy entitlement of a man used to being clever at another's expense. Richard's laugh was a small weapon. Michael had seen it point at people before. The first bright crack cut the music mid-measure. It was not much, only a sound, but in the ballroom it was everything. Glass chimed, then silence bent under shock. People froze like water held under a basin. A second shout followed, and then a body folded forward as if someone had turned off the current. Isabella had her hand on Sophie. Sophie's mouth opened, but no sound came at first. The hall smelled suddenly of perfume and of burnt fabric from a camera flash. Metal chairs scraped. Somewhere, a child's balloon bobbed listlessly on a table. Michael moved before thought could map danger. Movement had been an economy he understood where others saw panic. He ran through the narrow corridor like a man who had spent years rehearsing how to make sure others lived. The maintenance stair had teeth, small and hard. He slammed the service door and spilled into the edge of the ballroom. He saw the shooter at once, a figure with his face half hidden by a scarf, hands shaking, a cheap gun raised. The shooter's expression was raw, animal, and terrified. He was not a man who understood much beyond the narrowness of his own fury. Around him, people tried to press down. A chair overturned. A spotlight turned the nearest faces into moons. Michael had no plan. He had a reflex and a choice. He thought of Ella and her small wrist, of the nights when he sat up counting money and wondering if tomorrow's job would pay for milk. He thought, in the strange quiet before a decision, of his dog tag. He had never meant for anyone to read the words stamped on it: duty, honor. 2 words, simple and heavy as anchor chain. He did not think of heroic endings. He simply took Sophie between his arms because the child was closer and smaller, and the sound of the gun cut clean through other noises. "Get down," he breathed, not a command, but a promise. He stepped into the line between gun and child. He pressed his body forward. The shot cut the air. It was a single sound, bright and savage, and then a ragged thud as Michael fell. The room moved in jerks, people screaming, a woman overturning a chair to hide her child, a waiter dropping a tray of champagne that burst into 1,000 glass stars across the carpet. Sophie had her eyes tightly shut and was clutched against his chest. Michael's arm around her was instant and iron true. He tasted copper, the small metallic tang of fear. He heard Ella screaming, a ribbon of sound that brought him back far enough to see his daughter's hands reaching for him. He felt warmth on his shirt. He felt, too, the mechanical efficiency of a body that had been kept in readiness for other shapes of violence. The way his ribs flexed like guardrails, the way he breathed one word into Sophie's hair: safe. Paramedics arrived with a practiced calm that steadied the trembling world. They moved like people who carried hospitals inside them. They applied pressure and murmured into radios. The shooter was subdued, dragged away by security and 2 guests who had been braver than most. His eyes were blank with the recognition that his act had ended him too. Cameras flashed. Someone filmed on a phone, the recorded frame jerking, Sophie's white dress a bloom of light in the chaos. At the hospital, Michael lay in a room that smelled of antiseptic and coffee. Monitors hummed. Nurses moved in rhythms. Ella pressed a small hand to his wrist and watched numbers on a screen like a child examining weather. Sophie slept in a chair near the foot of the bed, her breath ragged but even. Isabella sat with her head bowed, a jacket draped across her knees like a shield. Her face had the hollowed exhaustion of someone who had stepped closer to mortality and found her own fragility. The scan showed a clean path through muscle and bone, and the surgeon's hands were steady and sure. They did not speak of miracles. They spoke of seconds and of sutures and of the work of bringing a life back into the line. The wound was not elaborated upon. It was an event that had carved a new geography across his chest and left a map for the surgeons to read. Later, under the raw fluorescence of the recovery room, a surgeon would say to Isabella in clipped, efficient sentences that his chance had been small and the courage had been absolute. Isabella did not know how to answer that. She only held Sophie tighter. Word leaked at the edges. A nurse, smoothing a blanket, had noticed the tag that hung under Michael's shirt: peeking out when his gown shifted, and had asked a question that sounded ordinary. Where had he served? The word veteran passed like a coin. A posted clip from a guest's phone threaded its way through social feeds, shaky and brief. A man in a vest throwing himself forward. The soft white of Sophie's dress. The fall. The clip gathered attention fast. Replies, prayers, demands for names. In the small, private room, people who had come to mingle were learning what the cameras could not help but show. That a man they had barely noticed had given everything without expectation. Colonel James Peterson arrived 2 days later with a careful stride and the blunt love of a man who had been trained to recognize a particular look in another. The posture of someone who had learned to carry responsibility through dark places. He saw the dog tag first, and he saw the way Michael's hands lay folded like a worker's hands on a child's blanket. The colonel had retired from the field and taken an office that smelled of polished wood and memory, but he had not lost the habit of identifying those who once stood at the edge of danger. The scan showed a clean path, through muscle and bone, and the surgeon's hands were steady and sure. They did not speak of miracles. They spoke of seconds and of sutures and of the work of bringing a life back into the line. The wound was not elaborated upon. It was an event that had carved a new geography across his chest and left a map for the surgeons to read. Later, under the raw fluorescence of the recovery room, a surgeon would say to Isabella in clipped, efficient sentences that his chance had been small and the courage had been absolute. Isabella did not know how to answer that. She only held Sophie tighter. Word leaked at the edges. A nurse, smoothing a blanket, had noticed the tag that hung under Michael's shirt, peeking out when his gown shifted, and had asked a question that sounded ordinary. Where had he served? The word veteran passed like a coin. A posted clip from a guest's phone threaded its way through social feeds, shaky and brief. A man in a vest throwing himself forward, the soft white of Sophie's dress, the fall. The clip gathered attention fast, replies, prayers, demands for names. In the small private room, people who had come to mingle were learning what the cameras could not help but show. That a man they had barely noticed had given everything without expectation. When she visited Michael, her words were few. She had learned to keep sentences efficient. Long speeches had once been her way to armor. Now, kneeling at the bed, she looked at his dog tag and read the faint letters with a mouth that formed the syllables slowly, as if broken into a new language. "Thank you," she said, and it was a sentence larger than either of them expected. "Just did what I had to," Michael replied. His voice scraped the raggedness of someone who had ached for something concrete to do all his life. He wanted to deflect the gratitude, because gratitude made his small life look like a spectacle. He wanted instead to slide back into the shadows of his vest, into the unnoticed fixtures of the world. But the world did not let him hide. The clip became a thread that pulled. Veterans from around the city reached out, messages folding into the conversation like old liners. A man from a local support group left flowers on the hospital bench. A reporter called the hospital for comment, gentle until she needed to be blunt. Social feeds demanded names. People wanted to know who had become a hero overnight. Richard Torres noticed too. He had been at the gala, smiling in photographs, leaning toward cameras with the composure of someone who believed that social advantage was a commodity. He had made jokes earlier about maintenance staff and had laughed with the small cruelty of a man who enjoyed the sharp edges of dominance. Now the footage showed a different hierarchy. Courage had once again upended privilege. Isabella watched Richard the way a surgeon might watch a wound that had been pressed closed but still pumped beneath the surface. She felt something like shame at his flippant jokes and a responsibility she had not allowed herself earlier. The company had been a stage for his behavior, and now the company would have to account. The ledger would need an annotation. Ella and Sophie met in slow recovery after the immediate danger had passed. Two small hands touched and found an ease between them. Sophie's gratitude was simple. She liked pirates, and Ella liked stories about secret agents, and both liked the same chapter book that someone had left in the hospital waiting room. They exchanged promises the way children do, solemnly, quickly, with an entire future folded into the pact. Ella drew a small picture of Michael with a cape. Sophie drew him without one, just as someone who could carry her. When word finally reached the public, it was not contained to a single frame. A local anchor spoke of bravery and of the randomness of violence. Comment sections filled with both praise and the small nastiness people reserve for one another. A clip from a security camera offered another angle. Michael, vest dirty, eyes far from the stage, moving fluidly, like someone who had practiced moving in places where falling could mean more than bruised egos. The footage invited questions and raised hairs on the back of someone's neck because the world recognizes the outline of a person who has been trained. Colonel Peterson became a hinge between the quiet hospital room and the world outside. He made a call to an old roster, and within a day a small collection of men and women arrived. Men with the same crinkled lines at the eyes, women with the same steady gait. They came not to parade, but to bear witness. They stood in the corridor and spoke in low voices about a time when Michael had been called something else. They called him Ghost Wolf in the half-jest of men who had named a comrade for the way he moved in darkness. "Why didn't you tell us?" an old comrade asked when Michael was lucid and small talk was allowed. There was no accusation in the question, only a curiosity about a life chosen. "Didn't want the work to be complicated by the stories," Michael said. He pushed a thin cup of water into his mouth like a man savoring a modest victory. "I like being ordinary." "You were never ordinary," the colonel replied. Michael reached for Ella's hand again when she appeared in the doorway, hair in two messy braids, clutching a small stuffed bear. His voice was worn but firm. "You're okay?" he asked, because that is the litany of fatherhood, the check of breath, the counting of small things. Ella nodded. "You saved her," she said, simply. A fact filed where many facts were stored. Michael felt the enormity of that simple sentence press against his chest harder than any bandage. Saving a life bent time in a direction where consequences tumbled down like dominoes. He had not sought recognition. He had only sought to make the small world he walked through safer for the child at his side. Still, the world had its own appetite for stories, and his actions were already being threaded through feeds and coffee shop chatter. Later, when Isabella rose in a company meeting and the room held its breath because the gala footage had made the ledger fragile, she did not reach for prepared statements that would hide responsibility behind language. She looked at a photograph of Michael caught on a phone on the internet. Vest, dog tag, body curved around a child. And she felt the bones of the organization align differently in her mind. She felt that what had been scored as philanthropic theater would now need to be rerouted into something honest. "Accountability begins with us," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. Board members shifted. She did not name Richard in that first meeting, but her eyes cut toward him with something like a verdict. The ledger would be rewritten, not in columns of donation amounts, but in programs that cared for those the company rarely saw: maintenance staff, janitors, contract workers. There would be hearings. There would be apologies. Isabella began to plan a foundation the way a person begins to build a house. Thoughtful, measured, with spaces for utility and warmth.
And yet, in the small city of the two girls' friendship, the public shifts felt like weather reported on a distant radio. Ella and Sophie shared snacks and secrets in the hospital cafeteria. They pressed their foreheads together and invented names for the dog tag that dangled under Michael's collar. They did not want the dog tag to be a thing that made Michael into a monument. They wanted it to remain part of the man who ruffled their hair, who read at bedtime in a voice that made the monsters seem apologetic. For Ella, the set of nights when he could not tuck her in were hard. For Sophie, the idea of bedtime with Michael at her side felt like safety that had been bought in an odd currency. Richard watched the world change around him. On the company feed, his earlier jokes were edited into a clip that made his smirk look small and mean in light of Michael's sacrifice. There would be consequences. Isabella's decisions rippled, and private emails that had once been casual were now evidence of a culture that tolerated cruelty. The company chose, in the quiet aftermath, to remove the source of mockery from its offices. Publicly, they called it a restructuring. Privately, it felt like a necessary excision. But none of that had yet closed over Michael like a blanket. He woke some nights with a start, the hallucinatory replay of sound and weight that followed trauma. The physical pain dulled and then returned like a tide, but it carried with it a sense of purpose renewed, being a man who could answer a child's cry with more than a promise. He returned, in thought, to ordinary things, the way Ella liked her cereal, the precise curl of her hair, the way she folded her socks. He imagined, with a tenderness that surprised him, afternoons of homework and the smell of laundry detergent. On a Thursday, he was visited by a man from legal, by a representative from public relations, and by a shy intern who had been the one to post the shaky phone video in the first place. They spoke of interviews, of press conferences, of the narrative arc that the footage had created. Michael listened. He did not want to be a spectacle. He wanted a life to be whole again. He wanted to find work. He wanted to teach Ella that courage need not always be loud. Colonel Peterson, pragmatic even in sentiment, left him with a short note and a number. "If you ever need anything," the colonel said, "call, not because the world couldn't manage, but because some debts are honor-bound." Michael folded the note into his wallet the way a man folds a small relic, careful, private. Ella asked once if he would go on television. He looked at her, at the way her lower lip caught between her teeth when she worried. "No," he said, "not unless it helps people we know." The clip continued to spread. Strangers left messages at the hospital window, cards, cupcakes, a faded flag pinned to a mailbox. Veterans offered meals. A journalist dug into Michael's past and found a series of commendations, quiet,
factual lines about discipline and service. Where once his past had been a closed book, pages now opened and people read, some with awe, some with simple curiosity. In a small apartment that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and of Ella's crayons, Michael pinned a fresh drawing to the fridge. 2 girls and a man with a line of stars over his head. Ella had written under it in shaky letters, "Daddy is my hero." He looked at the dog tag that lay on the counter and turned it over. The words stamped there, duty, honor, were simple because the world needed simple words sometimes. He did not crave accolades, but he felt something like the warmth of a work completed. Outside the hospital, the city tugged at the story in different pulls. Talk shows debated the randomness of violence. Commentators asked if the gala should have better security. A small movement of donations to the families of first responders began to form. A single hashtag trended and then sloped down like the soft exhaustion after a long run. The world was busy continuing its own life. Michael's life had new tangles in it, but at its core it remained the same. A father, a worker, a man who had practiced a singular devotion. In the quiet that followed the shock, Isabella called Michael's number and left a voice message that she erased twice before sending. When he answered on the 3rd ring, she spoke with a voice that had the ring of something changed. "I want to talk about the foundation," she said, "about making space for people like you, about insurance and dignity, about not letting this be a spectacle." Michael listened. He folded his fingers around the dog tag again and thought of Ella's small hand in his own. He had taken a bullet because the world required it in that second. Now the world wanted to give something back. He was wary of big offers. He wanted ordinary things, security, a place for his daughter, work that meant he could sleep without counting coins. He was also too weary to refuse help that would offer the small, quiet dignity he craved. When the colonel visited one evening and found Michael reading a book about fixing engines, he watched the younger man and felt something like relief. "You have a choice," the colonel said. "You can step back into the old life if it calls you, or you can take what's coming and let it support the life you wanted." The colonel's bluntness was a gift. It removed the pretense of too many paths. Michael closed the book and considered it. Ella carried a string of hospital-minted friendship between her and Sophie that would not be easily broken. The 2 girls met in a small park weeks later, their grown-up conversation about superheroes and bicycles unworried by the larger headlines. The dog tag had shrunk in their imaginations to a treasure. In Michael's mind, it remained a weight and an anchor. Outside, Richard Torres found his name rewritten in a new ledger. The company made a statement. They called for an internal review and promised to fund mental health resources for contract staff. Richard's career faltered as his jokes and emails were scrutinized in light of a culture that had allowed him to be careless. He would argue later that he was a scapegoat for institutional failures. Others would say his firing was overdue. For many watching, it felt like a small justice. A man had been shown the cost of cruelty. Inside the hospital room, Michael turned his face toward the window and watched the city go on. He thought of the dog tag, of duty and honor, and of his daughter's small hands folded in sleep. He thought of Isabella's new resolve and of Colonel's terse kindness. He decided, without rhetoric, that he would teach Ella the difference between being brave and being reckless. He would teach her that saving a life could be as much about showing up at soccer practice as it was about throwing a body across a child's chest. He would teach her to notice the quiet people. That night, when the lights in the hospital dimmed to the slow pulse that keeps vigil, he whispered into the dark, "You're safe now." And in the child's inhale, he heard a life worth protecting, returning its small, steady answer. Outside, the story continued to find new shapes: opinion pieces, a charity mailing list, a raw interview clipped mid-sentence, and somewhere a director of human resources drafted memos about dignity. But for Michael, the world narrowed into a handful of bright, ordinary things. A school book with crayon marks, the smell of pancakes on a Saturday, the low weight of a dog's head on his knee as he sat in a tiny kitchen. Those were the things courage had bought him. There would be more reckoning to come, and there would be difficult choices waiting in the boardroom, where Isabella would speak with a firmness she had not cultivated before. There would be veterans telling their stories on local radio, and a foundation proposed that would bear a modest name and a careful mission. For now, the immediate crisis had passed. People owed thanks and were finding ways to give it. Michael kept the dog tag under his pillow that night. Ella slept curled against his side, small and warm. Sophie, not far away, dreamed in the clean, untroubled way of children who had been held. The world outside the thin window of the hospital room continued to spin its large and complicated stories. Inside, the small stories of hands, of promises, of a cheap vest that had become a shield. They would not make him famous, and he did not want to be. He wanted to be present. He wanted to be mundane in the way a man who had once been extraordinary could only find peace by choosing the quiet life again and honoring it with the same fidelity that had led him to step between a child and a danger no one else would have faced.